Welcome back to the Wingspan Podcast, episode 17. I'm Doug Barak, joined by my co-host Chris Mulholland of Nets Daily, and our special guest. Our guest has been covering the NBA since the 2013 NBA Draft. He's worked for Sports Illustrated, SBNation, Slam Magazine, the Boston Globe Media, the Huffington Post, and Bleacher Report.
We welcome Jake Fischer to the pod. Thank you for taking some time out of your day to join Doug and I. How are you doing?
Hey, guys. Doing as well as you can during all this. How about you?
Pretty good. The same, day by day.
Day by day. So I guess we'll kick it off first. So we'll just talk about your journey to where you are today. So what college did you go to, and what was your first sports media position or internship?
I went to school at Northeastern University in Boston, and through that program, there's a lot of they had these built-in co-op opportunities. And so a lot of kids would take that summer off after your freshman year of college to kind of hang out before, until you graduated. Everyone was either in class or working during the summer. That's the way the school was set up. But I didn't want to wait. That freshman summer, I interned at Slam Magazine in New York, and it kind of got the ball rolling from there. As you guys mentioned, I covered the draft that summer and played a pretty, I wouldn't say a big role, but I played a role in the rumor mill that happens every year, and that kind of cemented myself amongst a lot of people in the league. So that's that was kind of the jumping off point for me.
And then one thing I want to talk about too, about college, especially being a college student, being a senior, well, technically a graduating senior, is one thing I want to kind of mention is in college, what were kind of your biggest takeaways that you learned when you were studying sports media?
I didn't I guess specifically study sports media. I was just a journalism major, but I mean, obviously, I was a sports writer kid in Northeastern Journalism School. Everyone kind of knew that's what my track was. And what I had noticed pretty quickly, I mean, when I was in school, early 2012, 13, 14, that's when Twitter really started taking off. And I realized that, I definitely don't do it now. You guys are way more active on Twitter than I am. But I realized that being active online and being a part of the conversation was important in terms of establishing yourself in the industry. So that was kind of a pretty big takeaway from the beginning.
And then can you just talk a little about how valuable connections is in this field? Obviously, a lot of people have kind of heard about it that aren't in the field, how connections are very valuable in this field. Can you just give a little insight on that as well?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I wouldn't have been – I never would have gotten SI if it wasn't for the fact that at the time, one of the co-managing editors of the website, SI.com, went to Northeastern. And SI has this big internship program. When they did, I don't know anymore, to be honest. They had this big internship program that pretty much every semester was bringing in kids from Northwestern. And the office was littered with Northwestern alumni. But, when I came back from my first co-op at the Boston Globe, my sophomore year of college, I came back to campus. I met with my career advisor, and she asked me where I wanted to go next. And I said SI. And she was like, I think we have an alumni who's pretty high up there. And she emailed this guy. His name is BJ Schechter. He's still a mentor of mine today. He's no longer with the magazine either. He's running Seton Hall's sports media program and does stuff at Baseball America. I mean, I worked hard enough to make him want to give me a shot. And when I was there as an intern and early on, I definitely tried to bust my ass, but I wouldn't have gotten the door without that connection through BJ.
So you brought up a good point, mentorship. So who are some of your other mentorships during your time as a writer? Some of the biggest ones early on, even those that you still work and connect with today.
Yeah, I mean, in the beginning, there weren't that many people that I was super close with, unfortunately, because I was viewing everyone as a competitor, which was kind of ridiculous. Obviously, it's a competitive industry, but I was literally I was in TD Garden at Celtics games as a 19-year-old, and national NBA writers would plop in, and I would kind of stare them down, oh, this is my competition. It's ridiculous. But I eventually learned this is a relationship business, like we just talked about, and you need to kind of get in touch with people. So, I mean, I kind of started really getting mentors when I got to SI in 2015. Pete Daniel was a huge influence on me even before he helped me. Like I would text Pete when I was an intern there because I met him through a media pickup run in Boston. Baxter Holmes was a guy he was a Celtics beat writer at the Globe. I like looked up to him and I definitely followed him and like tried to be friends with him. We're friends now, but like, and he still helps me out a lot. But in the beginning, like I was just some kid. He didn't really know who I was. And then, I mean, Lee Jenkins is with the Clippers now. He was the lead NBA writer at SI for forever. And I pretty much read everything he wrote and, overanalyzed every little detail, every little word to figure out how he did what he did. And I would pepper him with questions, and he was always so kind to get back to me. And he's still someone I could reach out to now for advice and for help. So I would say those three guys come top of mind right now.
Yeah, because I have mentors myself, and obviously, especially when you start out in this field, you don't realize the competitiveness like you highlighted in this field. It is a competitive industry, and obviously with mentors, they help you out. They give you those kind of help you adjust to the field, let you know what you're walking into. On top of that, how you can critique your writing. Just give a little perspective on me. Sometimes with my mentors, I would send over an article when it's published, say, hey, what could I have done better? Whatever the case is, they would chime in their feedback. So I completely agree with all the comments you made about your mentors.
Yeah, so switching gears a little bit. So when did you start watching the NBA, and what was one of your first NBA memories?
I was really lucky. I mean, my dad had season tickets to the Sixers growing up. So, I mean, I went to almost 30 games a year, probably even more some years. And I think my earliest memories, I went to one of the final games in 01. I don't really remember it like crystal clear, but I do remember the fact that Destiny's Child performed at halftime, and they were all wearing Kobe jerseys in Philly. And, Philly being Philly, like they got booed off the court. And like as they were going into the tunnel, people were throwing food at them because they were wearing Kobe jerseys in Philly, and Philly hated Kobe. There was this whole trope that in the draft in '96, he didn't want to go to Philly and like engineered his way to not go there. So, and he was a local product, so everyone hated Kobe, and it was something. Yeah, I was like 7 years old at the time, but I definitely remember the like court and the arena being dark, and then the spotlight coming down, Destiny's Child at halftime, and then people just booing them immediately. Them seeing Kobe jerseys.
So I gotta ask, you brought up two different things. So I'm gonna guess it's safe to say this Sixers were your favorite team growing up, right?
Yeah, at this point, I don't care about them at all.
Oh, of course, yeah. No, as a media member,
yeah.
you're more, the bias kind of falters. But who are some of your favorite players to watch growing up? Whether they're not just Sixers players, but also in the NBA.
My favorite Sixers player was Thad Young. He was just like a hustler, do-it-all, glue guy kind of guy that I'm sure you Nets fans came to know and love eventually.
Oh, yeah, Thaddeus.
I guess I was like a big kid. Like I was like 5 feet tall, like 100 pounds in like second grade, which doesn't sound that big, but like that was huge. By sixth grade, I had like another growth spurt. I was like pushing 6 feet tall, really, really big. So I always really liked Shaq. And he was goofy and personable, and that was like I had a retro like Shaq Miami Heat jersey. I definitely like really, really, really loved LeBron when he was in Cleveland. And then as like a pompous high schooler, I like developed a hatred for LeBron going to Miami for some ridiculous reason. Like I was like a sports radio talk host calling him a traitor and a quitter and like wanting to team up with players, even though I was 15 years old. But that was pretty much it.
And how do you feel about his journey thus far since it's coming towards the end?
About LeBron's journey?
Yeah, since we're getting to a much further point in that process, going back to Cleveland and now with the Lakers.
Yeah. I mean, LeBron's LeBron. I think he's fascinating from a lot of different standpoints. He changed the NBA for forever. I mean, what he did in terms of the player empowerment era that we're seeing right now and how he realized what his capabilities were and the agency he had within the NBA ecosystem. Forget any argument about who's the greatest player of all time. The fact he changed the NBA forever, and it's pretty unbelievable.
Oh, for sure. I mean, speaking of his ability to change things, will you see Space Jam 2 when it comes out?
Well, yeah, probably. I don't know if
what are your expectations without knowing what may actually happen?
Well, Ryan Coogler is directing it, right?
I honestly do not know much about the movie. I've just seen the apparel.
I think Ryan Coogler, who was the director most notably for Black Panther, is doing Space Jam 2. So if that's the case,
and then one thing
I'm curious enough.
For sure.
And then one thing I wanted to talk about too is kind of being a Philly native, a Philly guy. What do you think Kobe's legacy is in Philly?
Well, it's really changed since he's passed away. I mean, I think that always happens. People, when they die or when, their time is up. Like, Allen Iverson was such a polarizing figure by the end of his tenure in Philly, right? Like, the last 4 years he was there, 5 years he was there after the 0-1 finals appearance. Like, that's when he had the practice rant. He was drunk a lot, like, in team facilities. He was showing up, late all the time. He was, skipping things to go gamble in Atlantic City. Like, a lot of people hated Iverson by the end of it. And now he's like this fully beloved figure in sports. So I think being that Kobe is from Philly, and also people are inherently selfish, right? Like, they make every situation about themselves. So if you're from Philly, Kobe dying is in a way like a greater loss to these people because they can make it that way and they can paint it that way. And
which is very unfortunate.
Yeah, it's very unfortunate.
Exactly.
So
it's like profiting off of someone's loss, which is very relevant to this day and age.
Which is, I think, exactly what happened in Philly. So, I mean, I have a lot of friends who went to his high school, Lower Merion High School, and they're like trying to buy all this Kobe apparel now and like buy fake Lower Merion Kobe stuff online from like an Instagram ad. And they went to that high school and they weren't really fans of Kobe before that. So,
it's a very interesting times, 2020 specifically. So backtracking a little bit. So was covering the NBA always a dream and focus of yours?
Yeah, of course. I used to, growing up, we had assigned seats at my family's kitchen table. And every morning when I got down for breakfast, my dad pretty much every day had a copy of the New York Times or the Philadelphia Inquirer at my seat with like a Post-it note saying, "You'll enjoy this," or, great human interest story right here. And I grew up wanting to write the stories that my dad wanted to put on my desk, if that makes sense.
So what were some of the most impactful ones that he shared with you, if you can remember?
Oh, I don't remember any of them.
It's worth a shot.
Yeah, it's like, I mean, it's the kind of stuff that I write about. Like, I always joke, I very sparsely actually write about basketball. I write mostly about the people who happen to play basketball and the relationships that they form and their interests and their interpersonal connections throughout the league. Like, that's the stuff that's like my book. I've like written 2 chapters fully at this point. I'd say that's like 20,000 words. I'd say 500 of those words are actually describing what's happening on a basketball court. It's just not really what I cover.
Yeah, no, I get it. It's more personal, which is why we did this podcast in the first place. Get to know kind of the people that you may not know, or get to know their stories more, in going deep diving, as I like to say.
Yeah, 100%.
And then, let's just backtrack a little bit back to the 2013 draft rumor mill. Before you mentioned your involvement in that 2013 draft rumor mill, would you care to elaborate kind of the work that you put into that? Kind of what was your role in that, and just to overall just talk about it.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. When I was interning at Slam, I was in the back corner of their office. I told this story a lot. They had nothing for me to do. Like, pretty much once a week, they would. I mean, I was only in there 3 days a week, but once a week they would come give me some assignment. I realized pretty quickly. And they also said to me my first day, like, if you're sitting here bored or you're doing something wrong, like, you should be coming up with ideas. So I remember that the 2013 playoffs were going on. It was like the beginning of the big three in Miami. They had just lost to Dallas the year before, but they're back in the finals. They had that awesome conference finals series with the Pacers, and nobody's really covering the draft, and nobody at Slam was covering the draft at all. This is like well before the draft had a big market as in terms of like a media concept. So I was going through Draft Express, which it doesn't exist anymore. ESPN took them over. I was going through their mock draft, and they had, when you click the player in the mock draft, they had their player's agent listed. So I was just going through the second round and like guys in the late first round, and I was calling their agents and offering to write about them because no one at Slam was writing about them. Nobody was writing about these guys in general. They weren't top 5 picks. And I realized pretty quickly what I could do as a media member to help or contribute and be a factor for these agents, right? I was giving their players press. So then the Nets used to have this second-round pick combine in Jersey, and a couple of the guys that I wrote about were there. And DJ Steffens, this guy who went to Memphis, I don't know if you remember him. He like kissed the rim. He was a super freak athletic kid. He was like 6'5", and could jump and run at the gym. He had a really impressive showing, and I was talking to him afterwards. And then like 3 team people came up to me asking me if I knew him and wanted to know about his draft. And they gave me the numbers to stay in touch to talk about DJ. And that's how I realized, like, okay, I can I can tell stories about these players. I can get in contact with them through the agents, and I can then, provide information I learned from them through team people. And then that's kind of all how it works. And then just everyone uses those relationships to benefit each other. It's pretty straightforward.
So before we dive into some of the relationship with some of the specific players, how does it feel to grow in the league with one of the biggest stars, with probably one of the next future main faces of the league, Giannis Antetokounmpo?
I wouldn't say I grew with him, but
well, I mean, yeah, he did have a pretty fast. He kept growing after the 2013 draft, as we all know.
I definitely don't have any relationship with Giannis at all. But I mean, I've covered him throughout the year. It's been pretty interesting to see him grow and evolve. Like I remember, I was like one of the first people to. I think it was for SI. I was one of the first people to write about them kind of using him as like a point guard. So I don't know. It's just. I definitely feel like a kinship with guys in that 2013 draft class, but it's not like anything very interpersonal.
Okay, sure.
And then the backtrack to the 2013 draft. Did you expect Anthony Bennett to be drafted first overall? Probably not.
No, nobody did.
No one did. And then were you surprised with some of the – I know I may be jogging your memory a little bit, but there's been guys such as obviously Victor Oladipo is second. I think he was drafted by the Magic at that time. And then there's a couple other ones that like Nerlens Noel. This draft is a kind of a perfect example of like, I guess you could say today's draft with it's not the best player available. It's more of the fit. That's how teams kind of looked at it back then, especially with this draft. But what were some of you kind of looking back at it? What were some of the takeaways that you got from that event?
Well, it's very fresh in my mind because that's where my book starts off. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, to me, the most interesting thing is that, and a message I'm trying to get across in the book is that the draft has become this whole process, and I keep using the word ecosystem. That's really what it is. And a lot of it stems now, and if you talk to any NBA executive and they're speaking candidly, if you ask them what their biggest issue with how the league operates right now, an answer you're going to hear often is how convoluted the draft process is because the agents control so much of it, right? They hold who gets medical information. Some guys don't even go to the combine. Some guys don't even work out. At the beginning of my book, and I think what hung over the whole 2013 draft and really set the tone for everything, Nerlens Noel was hurt, and his agents did not want to project that he was going anything lower than 1. So they canceled meetings with teams below 1, and they withheld the medical information from, everyone that they didn't want him landing to. And he ultimately fell to number 6. And, John Calipari told me, who knows what would have happened if Nerlens went 1 Cleveland. Maybe he would have been traded to Minnesota in that Andrew Wiggins trade. Maybe he would have stayed in Cleveland and played alongside LeBron. Like, who knows what happened to him. So, and I really do think the only reason that Noel fell was because he was hurt. And I mean, he probably, if he was healthy, he probably goes 1. But because he was hurt and the way his agents handled everything, he went down to 6. And if Philly wasn't interested in trading up for him, I don't have no idea how much further he would have fallen. It would have been really interesting to see how far he would have gone.
No, I agree with that. Yeah, because I remember vividly. I remember Noel. Didn't he? I think he tore his ACL against Florida, I believe.
At Florida, yep.
Yeah, that's what it was. And looking back at it, like you said, a lot of people don't realize what that draft process goes into. Like you explained with the combine, agents kind of control what their players. Like you said with Noel, no teams below 1 did not. He told them no. And that's the interesting thing about the draft that a lot of people don't realize. And that's what the kind of the point that I brought up earlier about being a fit draft. This draft was more about fit, and especially with those players limiting the workouts with certain teams to players not wanting to meet with certain teams. So I want to go to this team, whatever the case is. I want to just go the highest pick, whatever the case is. That shows the draft process that a lot of these guys go through. Most certainly.
Another thing which is in the book is the Atlanta Hawks were dead set on trying to get Giannis. Dead set. And they just couldn't. It's been reported, but I've got a couple little bit more detail that hasn't really been out there yet. Which I'm not going to say now. Sorry, but
no way.
They were dead
a nice hint.
They were dead set at getting him, and they just couldn't trade up and pull the trigger.
I do remember that, yeah, because they took. I think they took Dennis Schroeder like 2 or 3 picks after that. Yeah, 17 and 2 picks later after that.
And
I
Shane
do
Larkin.
remember seeing reports on it, and then Shane Larkin, yeah. And then let's just kind of broaden a little bit and just talk about the overall NBA, kind of with your perspective of covering it. So, what are some of your favorite topics to cover within the NBA? Is it more social issues? Is it more of kind of the draft? Or is it more of kind of unique things or basic reporting, whatever the case is? Kind of what are some of your favorite topics to kind of concentrate on when it comes to the NBA?
I'm really interested on relationships. I think the last story I wrote, I don't remember the exact order of it, but like this year I wrote a thing about how Trae Young, when he was growing up in Oklahoma City, his dad played in college at Texas with Tony Petit and against a lot of other Pac-12 players who ended up being in the NBA. And when the Thunder finally came to town, Trae was a little kid. His dad would go to games and he'd contact his friends and get him post-game like backstage passes to go hang out outside the locker room. And he was meeting all these NBA players as a 9-year-old, 10-year-old, 11-year-old. And he ended up getting really close with a lot of guys, Chris Paul and Russell Westbrook and Kevin Durant. He would go to Kevin Durant's house as a high schooler to watch NBA TNT on Thursdays. So, there's no way that being around those guys didn't help him, immediately come into the league and be successful, because he's been around those guys his whole life. So stuff like that, I think, is far more interesting to cover and reveal to people than how Trae Young has worked on his pick and roll defense,
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, because especially too, it depends on the player, but a lot of players don't like to talk about that relationship factor, especially with other players. They may say, "Oh, why do you guys care about me and X player's relationship," or whatever the case is. But you see, like you just talked about Trae Young, you see obviously with the power of social media, you see pictures rise of a certain future NBA player at age 10, 11 next to Cavaliers prime LeBron or whatever the case is. So you see how those relationships, like you talked about, Trae Young going over to Kevin Durant's house, whatever the case is, that those definitely implement into these guys' games, especially, okay, what did they take away from them? What were some of the things that they learned? Whatever the case is, that shows the value. And that's what makes a good story. So I agree with that.
The other dirty secret is that the NBA, at large, I'm not talking about when you turn on ESPN at 8:00 on a Wednesday. I'm talking about the league office, front offices, the video room, guys making phone call. The NBA at large, very little much to do about basketball. There's so much behind the scenes that involves players, the players' families, the players' high school coaches, some trainer, the players, a player's girlfriend that no one knows about, except like the training staff on the team who help. Like, there's so many things that go on in the league that I'll never know, that you'll definitely never know, that fans definitely will never know, that like it impacts what happens on the court so much. So that's the kind of stuff I tend to really be more interested in.
I agree, yeah, because those are definitely still popular topics, especially with people want to really know. And I would say as a follow-up as well, I know that in the past you wrote about the headband story and a couple of those.
Yeah.
Can you talk about the inspiration behind that story?
I get a lot of story ideas just by watching games at night, like in the background, or just like, it's 9 o'clock and I have an hour to kill. I'll throw a game on. I just can't do that now during all this, and I'll see a player doing something or wearing a headband like that, and I'll just text somebody on the team like, where to get that headband, and then they'll tell me, and I won't think anything of it. And then, the next night I see somebody else wearing that headband. The next night I see somebody else wearing that headband, to the point where it's like, all right, this is a trend. And then I'll ask about it. And I like to think that a lot of the story ideas I get, people will just go, oh, that's a thing. And they laugh about it. And they're like, but that's too stupid of a question. I would never write about it. Like, you guys remember when Robert Covington was caught eating the stroopwafel on the bench earlier this year?
Yeah, I do. I do remember that. Yep.
Like, I wrote a whole story about that. Everyone saw that on Twitter, but like, I was the only one who was willing to ask medical trainers. Like, I literally went to the Mavericks trainer, who I know, his name's Casey Smith, and I said, I know this is a really dumb question, but what's the nutritional value of having these stroopwafels? Like, and I called the company that the team that teams buy those stroopwafels for. Like, I just feel like I understand it's ridiculous, and I kind of make fun of myself in the process of doing it, and I just ask questions that people probably think are too dumb and too stupid and goofy to even ask about, but they actually turn into pretty cool stories.
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely.
This podcast episode is brought to you by Anchor. Anchor is an app that allows podcast producers to record and create original content. It is free to record and create a podcast, giving producers the ability to easily edit their material off their phone or computer. Anchor allows producers and talent to make money off their work with no minimum listenership. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you on platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and many more. To get started, Anchor app or go to anchor.fm. Anchor for Doug and I has been great and allows us to bring unique, creative, and opinionated content to listeners of the Wingspan Podcast.
Could you call yourself, I guess, the master of miscellaneous, like all those other odds and ends that, people discuss lightly? Because I know you wrote some of my favorite ones that popped up. Chris, of course, spoke about the headbands, but late night Twitter, how that may impact their gameplay, playing hot potato, or basically a grenade with the ball, with the shot clock. Kendrick Perkins being one of the best teammates through his transition with the Celtics and Thunder, for example. Living through a 10-day contract and all that traveling, like all these little odds and ends that, may just be a sentence to some people or a few words, but you create like a full in-depth story about it. And to me, that kind of dedication to the craft about, it's the little things that have some of the biggest impacts. So can you talk about some of those stories? Like, what were some of your favorite to write about? And are there any others that you wish you wrote about looking back?
Anything I wish I would have written about is on my list to do in the future. So I'm gonna keep that to myself. I'm gonna hold that for safekeeping until the league comes back up. I wouldn't say I'm like the master of it, but it's definitely what I specialize in. Like, there are a lot of people who do good stuff like that too. Like Ben Cohen at the Wall Street Journal is unbelievable with finding. I mean, he's been covering this pandemic by finding sports connections to every single person involved in the government. Like, he's unbelievable. Yaron Weitzman's my friend at Bleacher Report. He does a lot of cool things. About like, he just did something about how NBA players change their phone numbers all the time. So I would like to think that people know that's what, like, my niche is, because they're like, when I'm at summer league, they're like, there are NBA people who come up to me and say, hey, like, what's the next like weird Jake Fischer story? Or like, oh, I have a weird story for you. So it's definitely like an identifiable trait of mine, but I wouldn't say I'm the master of it. But my favorite one was definitely profiling Red Panda. She was just like the nicest person I've ever met in my entire life. And her story and her journey and what she's overcome to get to where she is. And if you guys haven't read it, like, it's pretty haunting how she was, this like star pupil acrobat of her father. And she wants to. Her father died due to I think it was cancer. I don't recall, but he passed away somewhat recently, and she's getting older now, and she's not as good as she used to be, and like, she's haunted by wanting to appease him and be successful at her job, and this job has led her. She's single and just flies around the country, clipping bowls on top of her heads inside giant basketball arenas. And people love her, but like, she doesn't really have a family, and it's just interesting. She's a really, really fascinating person.
Yeah, so I got to ask a little bit more, like, of these stories, what kind of connections do you still have with some of the people that you've interviewed? Like, are some of them kind of one and done type thing, or is there anything more in depth with them that you may have?
I mean, there's a lot of people that I've written
Like, what
about.
are some of your most memorable? Let's rephrase it. What are some of your most memorable interviews that you may have that some of the story didn't necessarily make it into the document itself? Like, what are some things some maybe tidbits that you like to give us, or tangents?
I mean, the whole thing with David Griffin this summer was pretty memorable.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. We had an on the record conversation, and then he told the whole world that I took him out of context, which did not happen. So
Well,
that was pretty interesting. And
happens to the best of us. Yeah.
Yeah. So people still bring it up to me. So here's what it is.
Yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting time. Speaking of David Griffin, where do you think the Pelicans? What kind of trajectory do you think they are next? Because people had them where Zion would have stolen the Rookie of the Year award from John Morant. They would have snuck into the playoffs this year. Like, where do you see them?
I thought they were going to make the playoffs up until like the last 2 weeks before everything stopped, because they really kind of tumbled. But I mean, their long-term trajectory, is what it is. They have Zion.
Oh, yeah.
Brandon Ingram became an all-star this year. We'll see what that long-term fit is. I mean, I know a lot of people in New Orleans, and there's not exactly a consensus opinion on who Brandon Ingram is and what he'll be around Zion as they grow together. There's not a consensus on what exactly Lonzo is and how he fits alongside Zion. But I mean, you've got Zion, you've got Jackson Hayes, who everyone there is pretty. I mean, how can you not be excited about what that kid's potential is? I mean, he's like barely 19, 7'1". He might be the only player on the planet who can have a higher like jumping reach than Zion himself. So it's just like they're going to be a fun running athletic team, but the situation there is very, very uncertain. There's a lot of, basically after next season, all their contracts are kind of up again. And, there could be a new coaching staff. Like by the time the 2022-23 season's going on, like by the time Zion's up again up for a rookie extension, there could be an entirely different supporting cast, an entirely different coaching staff. And you got to factor in the fact they have all these picks moving forward too. Like they're going to be a player the second somebody like let's say Bradley Beal is all of a sudden unhappy in Washington and demands a trade. They're going to be at the front of the line with any team with assets to offer to go get a guy like that. So they could go any number of ways. It's just, I think it's very undetermined right now. And I think there's a path where they could be like the Thunder of old with KD and Russ and Harden. They could become contenders pretty quickly if the moves, match up. But it could also be a really slow process, and they could be, a middling playoff team for a couple of years, like, the Nuggets and the Cavs were with Carmelo and LeBron at the beginning of their career. I mean, LeBron made the finals once, obviously. They weren't like a real contender. They got obliterated by San Antonio. But like, they could be a team that is in the playoff mix. I just don't know. There's so many different paths, and they don't know. There's so many different paths that team could go.
Well, I think they should start by dethroning King Cake, but that's another story. So can you talk a little bit more about the field of sports journalism? Where do you think the field is kind of headed? Obviously, we're on a podcast now, so that is one indeed example. But from your experience, what have you found most effective thus far?
Kind of, I would say, just kind of where the field's overall heading. Kind of, you see a couple years ago with the newspaper industry, obviously the newspaper industry is struggling. Yeah. It's going down. Everything's kind of going online. You see a lot of freelance work online, with a lot of guys having to freelance at certain companies in order to kind of reach that end goal of getting a full-time gig with a certain company there. So kind of, I would say that kind of aspect within the field of sports journalism.
I mean, number one, predicting any industry at large in this current day amidst all this is, shaky. And two, I mean, if I knew where the sports media industry was going, I'd be really rich. So, I mean, I can tell you where I think it's going, and I think The Athletic has uncovered a pretty good model, being that, they've, snowballed all this talent across the industry. But as we've seen with SI and with, Deadspin and with ESPN a couple years ago, and, Fox ended up cutting all their contributors. It's a very untenable future. It just is. And I mean, I fear for my friends at The Athletic because their company is now putting out all this public goaling of when they want to be profitable by. Obviously, like I said earlier, the pandemic changes everything. But once a startup starts talking about finite goals of when they want to be profitable, that's usually when alarm bells go off. That's when ownership wants to sell. And then when a company gets sold to a new ownership group, usually that means, like I saw firsthand, usually that means they're going to want to cut costs and operate at a much lower operating cost to increase their revenue, right? So that just happened all over the media industry, and I don't think it's going to stop because, to me, the future of all media is the subscription platform for now. I don't know how long that future is, but the immediate future is that, right? And if you don't have a brand that establishes and conveys loyalty that people want to, like, right, like Netflix and chill is a goofy slogan, but it also encapsulates the fact that people know that, like, Netflix is a verb now, right? And that's important for people's habits and to be able to know, like, all right, when I'm bored at 10 o'clock, I can go on Netflix tonight. I don't know where that's going to go in terms of sports media content, and it's a scary proposition.
Yeah, exactly. I was just about to say it's a scary proposition. Obviously, the biggest fear is the fear of unknown, especially with industries. And I know, dating back, there was a couple of years ago, Warren Buffett sold all of his newspapers, and that was kind of a big red flag and a big alarm for a lot of people that are in the media field. I know, growing up as a college student, a lot of kids that sit next to me in class, they always say, should I pursue this? Or do we just talk about that kind of stuff? Is it a comfortable field to go into, whatever the case is? And as Brian Fonseca hopped on the pod in a couple episodes ago, he even said he understands why a lot of people 3 years, 4 years into kind of pursuing a career in sports journalism, they end up dropping because they see that it's not the security blanket's not there like a lot of other industries. But like you said before, this pandemic, a lot of industries are under stress right now, and you don't know what the end result's going to be until it comes and hits you in the face. So it's one of those things. And then,
I just say, I mean, I got really lucky that I came up right when social media was becoming what it was, helped give me a platform, and it came in right at the tail end of the internet, the written internet word, I would say. And now everything's everything is going towards streaming. That's just kind of where it is. So.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the big thing that has kind of been hovering around a lot of these questions is your upcoming book. I know as an author myself, you don't want to spill a lot of details. I know that's how I was when I was writing my book myself. So the floor is yours. Talk about your upcoming book, what it's about, and kind of whatever you want to share about it.
So the book is about tanking in the NBA.
Mm-hmm.
And it really focuses on the 2013 draft until the end of the 2015-2016 season, following Philly, Boston, LA primarily, because they all kind of tanked in different ways. Philly obviously had the very audacious, transparent plan under Sam Hinkie. They realized they were a mediocre team, and they traded to the bottom before they got stuck in the treadmill of mediocrity. They didn't want to keep being a 7th and an 8th seed anymore, right? Boston had won a title. They were still trying to fight with that group up until the 2013 playoffs to contend. They almost made the 2012 finals again. I remember they had the Heat down 3-2 in the 2012 conference finals.
I do.
LeBron kind of went off in Game 6. So they realized that they needed to move off their stars sooner rather than later. They traded off of their stars and moved down. So that's how they differed from Philly. LA, on the other hand, they kept on at Kobe. They wanted to build a contender around Kobe again, and they just never were able to do so. And struggling to adjust from the Kobe era, they ended up losing games because they coasted on their brand recognition, and they got really bad. And that era also focused, and it's going to focus on a couple other teams too, like Orlando and Phoenix and Sacramento, and a bit of Cleveland and Minnesota at the top of those drafts in 2014 and 2015. But it's really just focusing on the discussion that was happening at that time, as I'm sure you guys remember. Just like how now player movement and upcoming free agency kind of looms over the league as largely as who's winning the title. It was kind of before that. It was who's going to win the title, and then it was who's going to get the number one pick, and who's tanking, and who's positioning themselves. So who's a fun rebuilding team, right? On League Pass, everyone wanted to watch the fun young League Pass team, and watch this, these teams that had 3 straight lottery picks come together. So it really did change the discourse of the league. Obviously, the lottery got tweaked because of it. There's a bunch of other things that changed from it, and all those storylines kind of ended at the same time in 2016. Sam Hinkie resigned. Jeff Hornacek got fired in Phoenix. Byron Scott got fired in LA, or they didn't renew his contract as Kobe retired. Boston went from being like a plucky playoff team to being a legit contender in the East again. Orlando, Scott Skiles resigned because he kind of knew the writing was on the wall in Orlando, and Scott Skiles resigning in Orlando really hit the point home that Rob Hennigan did not do a good job of rebuilding that team after trading away Dwight Howard. So it's kind of focusing on that era from 2013 to 2016, and the behind the scenes stories of what happened, the anecdotal histories of what happened, and how that era kind of set the stage for modern team building as we know it.
No, that's a very good topic for a book. I would definitely be interested in reading about that. And then, I will. And then as well, being an author myself, a lot of people always have the vision, especially as a journalist, of, let me pursue becoming an author and writing an official book. And a lot of people, especially, kind of don't realize the work that goes into writing a book rather than writing a simple article or whatever the case is, or a story. It's a lot of work that goes into it, at least from my personal point, from citing hundreds of sources to sending hundreds of emails, and you name it. You probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Can you just talk a little about kind of that work that it needs to be put into to kind of make a good book?
Yeah, I've worked on this for over 2 years, and I've interviewed over 200. I've interviewed for over 200 people, so that means I probably have reached out to 500 people, and that many people either said no or never got a response or that type of thing. So that's how it works. So it's been. I mean, I actually yesterday just got back to writing. I was writing today until you guys made me get on this call. But before I started writing again yesterday, I took 2 weeks off just to transcribe all the rest of my interviews, which, a lot of people use systems and tools now to do that for you. But I think it's really important still to kind of hear everybody's, tone and their expression and to hear their storytelling again. I mean, half of these phone calls that I listened to, I conducted 2 years ago, so I still think it's important to go back and listen to what they had to say. So it didn't just take me 2 weeks. That was like 2 weeks of sitting down, concertedly transcribing. It took me so long to transcribe. So it's a bitch and a grind. It really is. But,
I know. Yep.
I think that at the end, like right now, I have all this work done and all my notes in front of me. I have a monitor on like a layer, maybe it's 6 inches above my actual desk, and I have all my notes up there, my laptop underneath that, and it's really fun to just write and craft together the story and interweave all these different storylines. Like to the way the book is set up, like the first chapter ends at the end of the first round of 2013 draft, and it talks about the Sixers trading like 4 different picks in the second round of that draft. And then a report comes out that Brett Brown has agreed to terms to become their head coach. But then the Sixers deny it because they then go on this long head coaching search through August. I don't know if you remember. And part of that coaching search was Sam Hinkie reaching out to Celtics assistant Jay Larranaga, and the Celtics had hired Brad Stevens, and Brad Stevens is waiting for Jay Larranaga to find out if he's leaving for Boston or leaving for Philly. So those moments where these stories of these franchises intersect, like tying those together has been really fun.
Oh yeah, most definitely. And then I could tell you too, there's no better feeling when you actually get that first copy and you're holding it and you're like, wow,
I can't wait.
I did that. Yeah, it's the best feeling in the world. Well, I guess the final question I got for you on this, I know it's early and I know the process does take the right one. Are you eyeing any release date, any month, any year, or you think just kind of
spring 21? So
there you go. Perfect.
I mean,
all right,
I hope it'll be out by this time next year.
Perfect. Well, hey, keep us posted, and I'll definitely purchase a copy for you.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no doubt. So let's transition to the final question that's unfortunately still very relevant in our lives. So with the global pandemic of COVID-19 putting the sports world at a halt, do you think the NBA will resume play in the upcoming months, and how do you think they should approach this?
Well, how I think they should approach it is different than how I think it will happen.
Oh, no doubt.
What I think they should do is I think they should cancel the season. This is ridiculous.
I agree.
I know for a fact that they're very, very much hoping to be able to do this. The buzzword that it's become is this NBA bubble idea where, and I've seen it. I mean, I've been in summer league since 2013 every summer. I've seen how the NBA takes over Vegas and Vegas caters to the league. They put everyone up in hotels and they get police escorts to get the buses back and forth. I get it. It definitely seems feasible, but I mean, look how quickly it spread around the league, and that's just people who actually got tested. Like all these teams that weren't showing signs that didn't get tested. Who knows how many of those players actually got infected? So, and if you put those players, theoretically, like to get them all to Las Vegas, they're gonna have to fly there. There's gonna be hotel work. Like it's absurd to think about how many opportunities that idea would present for the virus to keep spreading, right? So but I also understand from a business perspective and from like an NBA historical perspective why they'd want to try. So it's tough. I think that we will see. I do think we will see NBA games. I don't know. It might be in September, but I think they're gonna, because they also, it's a very real thing. I don't know if you guys have heard about it, how teams have most local TV deals are contingent upon reaching 70 total games.
Oh, wow.
And that's a real thing. So many teams need that. If I'm not mistaken, the local TV deal does not factor into BRI.
Yeah, you're correct. You're correct on that. Yeah,
that's a big factor in these teams making money. So I understand why they're focusing on keeping hope alive. I mean, it's also only April 3rd. Like, who's to say that the virus won't, start dramatically decreasing by June, and then maybe by early August they could get back into. I don't know, but to me right now I think from all the reading I've done, we're so early into this situation that it just doesn't seem pragmatic to expect the league to come back.
Yeah, no, definitely. I've seen some players mention it. One of our last guests mentioned it. Staying NBA ready is probably one of the biggest factors. Bless you. Not alone having a facility, making sure everyone's healthy, whether they have symptoms or not. But like staying game ready was one of the biggest things that was mentioned, because if you're not in shape, not just regular game season, but playoff ready, and like what's the point? Like that's very dangerous to the product, to the players. And one of the other things was, I forgot which players mentioned this, but the December 25th start would be interesting. And if they did that, if that became like a permanent thing going forward. So I don't know what your thoughts are on those two bits.
Say that last part again.
Basically what your thoughts were, because the inability to stay game ready, because not everyone, lives in, I'm going to exaggerate and say a palace/mansion. Like some of them live in some tiny apartment in Brooklyn, for example. And where are they going to put a moderate sized gym? All they can do is a station bike, Peloton, whatever. Like it's only so much shape you can be in. And that's not really equivalent to being playoff ready, let alone, finals or whatever,
Yeah, I mean, that was a big concern during the lockout year, that there's going to be an increased level of injury. So it's obviously unprecedented. No one really knows the best way to go about it. But I just, especially with the fact that, like, you look at some cities, Toronto, banned all public gatherings until June 30th. Like, if that's the case, I was just texting my buddy in DC who's a New York Times reporter. Like, I don't even know if the government has a plan to wind all this down. We're not just gonna. There isn't just gonna be a day. Let's call it May 30th. There's just gonna be a day like May 30th where, we're out of shelter in place now. We're back to normal. It's gonna have to go in like a reverse process of what this happened, right? Like first, restaurants went down to 50% capacity, and then went down to 25%, and then it went down to takeout only, and then it went down. I'm saying it's going to have to. Yeah,
they have to moderate it because there is a very high probability, especially because of a country as large as ours with so many different governing sources, that relapse, for lack of better phrasing, is very possible. And I think that's about as scary as the apex, being so close but also so far, because we're not all treating this the same way at the pace and, etc. Like, I don't know.
So I just think I think putting players on a plane and then shuttling them around a city to play a game, even in an empty arena, I just think, how is that possibly going to help society slowly get back to normal? I just don't see it.
Exactly. I can't agree with you more on that. And like you said before, it's with the TV deals. I know there's a lot of business aspects to having the NBA play a certain amount of games, but I'm with you on this one. I agree that the NBA should just kind of just look at the big picture here and look at just kind of canceling the season, because that's with this going on, no one knows when it's going to kind of downfall, let alone when it's going to stop. So I agree with you on that. But hey, Jay,
yeah, I mean, the last thing is like if they come back late and push they're going to see ramifications of this on the NBA calendar until like 2024.
exactly.
So
Yeah, for sure. The calendar is going to be a bunch of puzzle pieces all over the floor. It's going to take a while to put them back together.
So who knows?
Who knows? Well, Jake, thanks again for taking some time out of your day to join Doug and I. We really appreciate it.
You got it. Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, of course. We hope you and your family are doing well during these unique times. So, Chris, would you like to give the closing remarks?
Yeah, so guys, feel free to email over any suggestions, questions, comments, or thoughts on any of our content by sending an email to wingspanpodcast@gmail.com. And do not forget to follow us on Twitter and our Instagram accounts, and subscribe to our podcast on your preferred listening service.
Yay!